Thank you, worship team. We appreciate you. Thank you for joining us online, those of you who are joining us online today. Thank you, Linda, for that beautiful prayer for fathers. We appreciate that so much. Happy Father's Day to those of you here today and father-type figures. My father passed away, so I'm celebrating Father's Day in a different way. He passed away several years ago, but I'm also a father. I've got two, now three beautiful little girls, and there have been a lot of men while my dad's been gone that have spoken into my life, and so I just appreciate those good, godly men who have invested in me. If you're just joining us, we've been on a journey through the book of Hebrews for the past couple of weeks, and we're going to be specifically looking at today Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 to 19. And I want to begin with a question. Have you ever had a fixation? Have you ever been fixated on something to the point where it took all of your focus? Because that's what a fixation is, right? It's an obsessive interest in or feeling about someone or something, to the point where not only does it consume our thoughts, but it begins to consume our time, our effort, our energy, and even our finances and resources. Have you ever been fixated on something to the point where all you can do is think about that one thing? We have some students going to middle school camp this week, and I think back to middle school, and when I was in middle school, I was fixated on video games. Right? The Legend of Zelda, specifically. I would get up in the morning before school, get ready, go downstairs, turn on my N64 with my Wavebird controller, and I would play The Legend of Zelda. And I'd come home from school, and I'd go downstairs, turn on the TV, turn on my N64, and I would play The Legend of Zelda. When I'd sleep at night, I'd close my eyes, and I could see the video game, on the back of my eyelids while I was trying to sleep. I would have friends come over for the weekend or after school, and we would play video games. It was a fixation for me. And then I hit about 16 or 17 years of age, and I developed a new fixation. I had to get a car. Right? Any car lovers in the room, right? I had to get a car. Right? I could drive. But to get a car, I had to get a job so I could have some money. But I didn't want the money to get the car. I wanted the car so I could take girls out on dates, right? You follow me? You follow me? And I had to have money so we could actually go and do something. Girls became my fixation. And sometimes these girls would live 10 minutes away. Sometimes they would live 2 hours away. And I would have to plan my schedule and work around my job so I could go out on dates with these girls. And it felt like a constant balancing act, right? Because I had to have money so I could have a car and have insurance and have gas and go do stuff. But I had to work for that money. And if I was working, I couldn't go out on dates because I was always busy working, right? So you see the problem there? I had to juggle all of that. And, it took my money, it took my time, it took my focus, and honestly, I could go on about times in my life where I was fixated on deer hunting. I could go on about times where I've been fixated on football, times where I've been fixated on wrestling, hockey, even politics, all things at one time or another that have been fixations for me, some of them probably even in unhealthy ways. And if we're honest, I just think if we're honest, we can probably all identify seasons in our lives, our moments in our lives, where we've been fixated on such things. Maybe it was a relationship, maybe it was a person, maybe it was a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or maybe it was a job opportunity, right? You had an opportunity to maybe get a better job or gain better employment or benefits or something like that. You want to climb the ladder, and so that just took all of your time and your attention, your energy. Maybe it was on more money, like, side hustles and types things, or maybe getting a job promotion, or maybe it was a particular hobby type thing. And maybe that was a good fixation, maybe it was an unhealthy fixation. But again, whatever it is or was, it's affected or affecting how we make decisions, how we make choices in different areas of our lives. But I think we can agree that, there's healthy fixations and there's unhealthy fixations. And actually, as we dive into Hebrews chapter 3, to this letter in this little house church in Rome, this is the kind of language that we encounter. This is what we see. Chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "Therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest." And if we can just kind of rest there for a minute, I don't think this is language that's new. If we read our Bible, I don't think there's anything new in this language of fixing our thoughts on Jesus. There's a lot of places in the Scripture where we're encouraged to focus our thoughts and minds on Jesus, his kingdom values. Romans 12 tells us to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. 2 Corinthians 10 tells us to take our thoughts captive, right? And make it obedient to Christ. James tells us in chapter 1 to dwell on or look intently into the perfect law, who would be Jesus. And in Philippians 4, Paul says the things that are noble and pure and good and righteous, these are things that we should think about. These are things that we should fixate on. Just like we're reading here in the letter to this church in Hebrews. Again, the author says, fix your thoughts. And the Greek word for that is katanoeo, and it means to consider. It means to behold, like to focus on, to set our mind on, to think about, to fix one's eyes on. Because again, this little church that we're reading about, they were struggling. They were struggling in their context. They were dealing with apathy. They were feeling discouraged. They were, tempted to give up or give in or participate in other things. They're constantly being pulled by the spiritual current of the dominant culture, and we're in very real danger. And so the encouragement for them, as well as for us today, as we experience the consistent and steady pull of the currents of life, the encouragement is to, like them, fix our eyes on Jesus. Fix our eyes on Jesus, the very question we're going to be asking today. How do we fix our eyes on Jesus? How do we focus our thoughts on him? And it's interesting what this author has to say in verse 2. He jumps back and says, he was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, bearing witness to what would be spoken by God in the future. But Christ is faithful as the Son over God's house, and we are his house if indeed we hold firmly to our confidence in the hope in which we glory. Now, what's going on here? That's the question we're asking. Notice the author, they're continuing this argument that we saw right away in chapter 1, this idea that Jesus is supreme, that Jesus is the highest, most greatest, he's above. He's greater than the prophets, right? That's what the author is saying. They're still using this literary technique to communicate the hope the people in this little house church can have in the person of Jesus, so they can be confident to live out their faith in their current socio-economic political climate. Again, this audience that's being written to has very deep Jewish roots. right? They would have been very familiar with Moses, who the author is using and comparing, very familiar with him. He would have been the one through whom the law was given. The first 5 books of the Bible, the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, he spoke with God on the mountain. He parted the Red Sea. If ever there was a hero or great leader to the Jewish people, Moses certainly was in the running. He was in the running. But what does the author say? What does the text say about Moses? It says Moses was a servant in God's house. Moses was a servant in the household of God. Yet Jesus is the builder of the house. Moses was the servant. Jesus is the builder of the house because God is the builder of everything, and Jesus is God. So if you look at Moses and you read about his life, the ups and downs, you see that there are moments where Moses fails. God still uses him, but there are moments where Moses fails. You read the New Testament, you look at the Gospels, what do you notice about Jesus? Jesus doesn't fail. Jesus doesn't fail. So we don't want to fix our eyes on Moses. We want to fix our eyes on Jesus. We want to fixate on him because he doesn't fail. And one of the ways we can do this is by recognizing he is greater than the greatest. That's who he is. The Jews and even Christians of that day and today hold Moses in high esteem. We look at Moses and we're like, whoa, right? There's a man of God. There's a man worth following. But then he fails. And when he fails, we're like, what's going on? It's like we're surprised. For some, when this kind of thing happens, when we're looking at somebody that we hold in high esteem and they fail, it shakes our faith. It shakes our world. Because someone whom we respect as a leader or spiritual leader fails, we have this tendency to question, did I make a mistake too? Is this whole faith thing really real? Is what I learned from them good? And suddenly, we fall away from faith, or we fall away from church, or we fall away from Jesus because our faith was in a person. Our faith was in a structure. Our faith was in a location. It wasn't in Jesus. If you pay attention to the news, you know that this week, Tony Evans, author of many Christian books and studies, pastor, leader, he stepped down or resigned from his position because of a sin in his life that needed to be dealt with. And for some people, that hit really hard. They're like, what, Tony Evans? Tony Evans? How could this happen to Tony Evans? Like, he's such a great preacher and a speaker of truth. If he's dealing with this, how can I trust him? How can I be sure that, what he's telling me is what I need to hear and and it rocked some people's worlds. Their faith was shaken. I've already seen posts on social media. A few years ago, there was another popular Christian leader, Ravi Zacharias, caught up in a sex scandal. Right? Christian apologist, author, speaker. I got books on my shelves by him. Brilliant Christian teacher, but he failed. And again, it shook people's world. Many people's faith was shaken. What I noticed, friends, in drawing correlations is that sometimes we pick out pastors and leaders and we hold them in high esteem. We hold them up like a Moses. We follow them instead of Jesus. We attend a church for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden, when the pastor has to resign or steps out of leadership, or there's a change, we're like, well, I guess I'm going to go to this church over here, and we leave. What does that say about who we're following? Like, I know there's reasons, and stuff like that. I'm not stupid. What does it say about who we're following? What does it say about why we're gathering with the body of Christ? And if we're not careful, what we end up doing is we follow people. We follow music artists, and we follow athletes and authors and political leaders who all claim to follow Jesus. And before we know it, instead of fixating on Jesus, we're fixating on them. We're fixating on their popularity, their talent, or what they can do for us instead of Jesus. And then when things go awry, we're surprised. We're like, what happened? Like, I thought, it's like they mess up, and all of a sudden we're like, oh no, what do I do, right? The world is ending. Because what we thought was true suddenly isn't. Because we had misplaced faith. My friends, if this little house church was going to persist, they're going to have to get their minds right. They're going to get their focus right. They're going to have to focus on Jesus. Reality is Christian leaders come and go. Christian teachers come and go. The only thing that makes them good or great, if there is such a thing, is that they follow Jesus. That's it. The Apostle Paul said it like this in 1 Corinthians 11. Follow my example as I follow Christ. Right? There's a clause in there. Follow my example as I follow Christ. If I'm not following Christ, don't follow my example. You could say it that way. And it could have been the same in this little church, that they were struggling because there were those here who were still trying to follow Moses. They still had their eyes fixed on Moses. They still had their eyes fixed on the law and trying to earn right standing with God through their traditions and their own efforts. In fact, this was common actually for many New Testament churches, and people known as Judaizers would come in and try to convince people that, you have to follow the law of Moses before you can follow Jesus. You've got to become a Jew before you can become a Christian. They had to follow the example of Moses because that's the way that things had always been done. Friends, the only reason Moses' example would be worth following is because it pointed to Jesus. Because Jesus, if you read what the author says, isn't just part of the house. He's the builder. He's the builder. Therefore, we must train ourselves to recognize this, not to just look for, the most attractive house. Not to just look for the best program or inspirational or enthusiastic leader or structure to draw our attention and meet our wants and needs and desires. But no, for this church to move forward in its mission, to impact our community like the little house church that we're reading about, the most important thing that we can do is fix our eyes on Jesus. That's it. Fix our eyes on Jesus to recognize that He is greater than the greatest. Now look at verse 7. That's the first thing. Look at verse 7. As the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion during the time of testing in the wilderness where your ancestors tested and tried me. Though for 40 years they saw what I did, that is why I was angry with that generation. I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. Now, there's a ton of background here. Again, very Jewish type author. And what he reminds them of here is that the people of Israel turned against Moses in the past. Right? After Moses led them through the Red Sea and out of Egypt and out of captivity, he brought them to a place called Rephidim. And there the people, they actually complained, they actually spoke against Moses because there was no water for them to drink. They're like out in the middle of the desert and there's no water. Listen, I'm not that intelligent, but if you're in the middle of the desert, there's no water, that's a problem. And the people are like recognizing this, like, we have no water. Moses, why did we follow you? Why did you lead us out here? And then they rebelled, they doubted God's provision. They doubted that He could meet their needs. And yet God had Moses stand in front of the people, strike a rock with his staff, and water came gushing out for them to drink. In another miraculous way, God was demonstrating to the people that He could meet all of their needs. He was for them. Then the author also talks about these 40 years. The author is referring to where God brought them to the brink of the promised land. to the land that he said he was going to give them to possess so that they could be a blessing to all the nations around them. They're right there. And they're looking at the people of the land and they're going, they're a little bigger than us. You think I could take him? No, you can't take him. How about him? No, you can take him either, right? And they're afraid. And so they're like, we're not going up. And they rebel against Moses again. They rebel against God again, even after he had done miracle after miracle in front of them, even after they had heard his voice from Mount Sinai. And this was their pattern, right? Poor me, poor us. If only God would do this, if only he would do that. It was like it was never good enough. They didn't just not trust Moses. They didn't trust God. Some of them, in fact, they looked for other leadership. Well, let's get this person to be our leader. Some of them, they made idols. These are the gods that brought us out of Egypt. Some of them, they said, hey, let's go back to Egypt. We had it better there. And it wasn't just that they didn't hear his voice because they heard his voice. No, they didn't hear his voice. They don't want to hear his voice because what he often asked of them required faith. It required trust. It required them to actually do something, and they didn't want to do it. I know you said we can go into the promised land, but I'm not sure I heard you right. I don't really want to go into the promised land. That's going to be hard. We're going to have to trust. And so the warning for this little house church is captured in verse 7. A quote of Psalm 95, verse 7. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Listen, which is the second way that we fixate our thoughts on Jesus, not just by recognizing he's greater than the greatest, but by looking for and listening to his voice. I'm going to tell you all a story about my kids, okay? But I want you to know I'm not picking on them, all right? I'm not trying to embarrass them, but more so use them as an example of humanity in general, all right? Because like all kids, my kids have bedtime. They don't get to stay up as late as they want. I mean, those years are coming later on down the road. But for right now, we have a bedtime in my house. And the parents know that kids need rest, and they need to get the rest that they need in order to do that. You got to be in bed at a certain time. Otherwise, the next day, they're not going to be able to focus. Right? They're not going to be able to receive the communication that they need to receive, and the communication they give back, that's not going to be too pretty either, because they're going to be tired. It's going to affect the way that they give and receive communication. So generally, in the evening, before bed, they'll be chilling out and reading, watching TV, YouTube, we'll be playing a game or something like that. And you know that selective hearing type thing? Where my husband's at, right? You know that selective hearing? Right, where we hear, but we don't hear. Apparently that affects kids too. Because we'll be like, hey guys, it's time to go to bed. And they hear us, but they don't hear us. And why don't they hear us? Because they're not looking for our voice. They're not looking for our voice, because if they acknowledge our voice, then they got to respond to it. And they don't want to respond to it because they don't want to go to bed. At night, they aren't listening for our voice. They aren't listening for our voices because generally we're going to ask them to do something that they don't want to do or they don't want to hear. And they'd rather just chill and enjoy the moment rather than respond to our calls. And honestly, friend, it is easy for us to look at kids and be like, how dare them, right? With that selective hearing. How dare they not want to hear us? How dare they not respond? But at the same time, how many of us get a phone call and we're like, nah, I'm not talking to that person? How many of us get a text message and we're like, nah, too busy? Right? Or hey, there's Pastor Tim, wonder what he wants. Swipe. Or there's Miss Jen, she probably wants something. Swipe. You know what I'm talking about? And there's members of our family and neighbors, and just like kids, we avoid conversations with certain people because we know that they're going to ask us something, and we don't want to do it. So we don't listen. And here's the thing. Here's where I'm going with this. I wonder if that's sometimes why we don't get involved in the mission of the church. I wonder if that's why we sometimes don't read the Bible a whole lot. Because we're afraid that if we hear from God, we're going to have to respond. We're going to have to do something. I wonder if that's why we sometimes aren't spending as much time in prayer, because we're going to hear God's voice and we're not sure that we can really go along with what God is going to say. Because we know that if we talk with God, He's going to ask something of us. And we're not really sure whether we want to do that thing or not. Not necessarily because we don't value what God says or don't think it's good, but because we don't value it enough. Because we don't trust what God has in store for us is better than what we're already busy with. We think things are better over here or better back there, even though God has shown up in our lives in multiple places and multiple times, giving us fresh water to drink, continuing to pour out His Spirit and feed us. It's like the author is saying to us, reminding us from Israel's past, that what God has in store for us, like this little house church in Rome, is far better than what we could ever ask or imagine if we would just listen. If we would just obey and align our hearts with His, we could enter His rest. And we'll talk more about that next week, but my point is, what is God speaking to you? What is God speaking to us? Are we listening? Do we want to listen? Or are we so busy with life and in our other business that we can't hear? Or are we seeking out and creating spaces for God to speak? This right here, every time we gather together, we're inviting God to speak to us. Saying, God, I want to hear your voice. I'm looking for what you have for me. But what about during the week? Like, are we looking for God's voice during the week, in the morning or in the evening or in the afternoon? Like, where are we creating space to hear His voice on a regular basis? And then how are we responding to that? Are we listening? When He speaks, are we obedient? Are we fixating on His words? Look at verse 12. It says, "See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily, as long as it's called today, so that none of you will be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. We have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold to our original conviction firmly to the very end. As has just been said, today if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion." And then if you go on and read, the author reiterates the last few verses that we actually just went over in the last point, signaling the importance of listening and obeying. When things are repeated in the Bible, they're generally important. So we get that twice there. But notice verse 12 specifically. "See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily." Focus on those words with me, if you will. Focus on those words. Listen what he says. He says, see to it. I think those words are incredibly important. See to it. Make sure this happens. If you are going to survive, if you are going to make a difference, this is of utmost importance. Number one, encourage one another. You're going to make it. If you're going to survive, if you're going to make a difference, you got to encourage one another. Number two, hold on to your original conviction. Hold on to that moment when you first experienced Christ moving and stirring in your heart that led you to a decision to follow Him with everything that you knew possible. That's the third way that we fix our eyes or thoughts on Christ, by looking out for and encouraging one another, reminding of ourselves on a regular basis, reminding each other what Christ has done originally and continues to do in and through us and around us. It was a pretty cool week this last week. Our kids were away at camp, and it was like just Ashley and I and the puppies that were taken care of. Right? Camp was awesome. Like we had a young student from our group give their life to Christ. That was incredibly awesome. I can't wait to see what happens this next week. But while the kids were away, the adults will play, right? Ashley and I went on 6 dates. 6! I don't even think we went on 6 dates in total in the last year. We went on 6 dates. Monday night, we went to the new Longhorn Steakhouse. Tuesday afternoon, we went to Taco Bell, right? Wednesday, Taco Bell counts, okay? It may be cheap, but it counts. Wednesday, we went to Chick-fil-A and got a milkshake. Thursday, we went to Culver's. Friday, we went to Aunt Sue's up at Table Rock and got more ice cream. And then Friday night, we had a rehearsal dinner where we got to eat over at 313. So, I mean, like 6 dates in like 5 days. That's amazing. I'm like, pat myself on the back for that. Yeah, that's good. That's good. And so that first Monday, we went to Longhorn. And you know how it is when you go to, like a Longhorn or, some other restaurant where, you gotta wait in line. You get there, they're busy, you check in at the hostess table, and they're like, okay, we got your name, and, we'll shoot you a text when we're ready. And so we go back, sit in the breezeway, I pull up my phone, it's cool, I get this little text, and they're like, click here, and you can see what number you are in line. And I'm like, oh, that's sweet. So I click, and there's like a party of 7, party of 2, party of 3, and you go out, and we're like number 7. I'm like, sweet, 7. And you know how it is. If you stare at your place in line, you can make yourself go faster. And so I'm like on my phone, I'm like looking, and then there's like somebody across from us, and they're like a little bit behind us, and I'm like, are they going to get seated before, or are they going to get seated after? And it's a little bit of a competition type of thing, and then all of a sudden, oh, we're up 4, and so like I'm staring at my phone when I hear Ashley whisper to me, if this was our first date, you wouldn't be on your phone. You would be with me. And I thought, oh no. Like Tim Allen was in my head. Right? I was like, oh, this is bad. Right? She's right here. We're together without kids, just the two of us, and I'm busy watching our place online, like in line on the phone, instead of being present with my incredibly awesome, wonderful, beautiful wife, right? We're about to have our 3rd child, and I'm on my phone? Like, does anybody else, see the problem here? Okay? That first date, I hung on her every word, right? I looked into her eyes. I lost myself in them, right? I just marveled at her beauty. Somehow, I lost my conviction. Somehow, I drifted from that first experience and became focused on something else. And in that moment, I needed her so bad. I needed her encouragement. I needed her to remind me. You remember when we first met? That nervousness and the sweat. And that thump, 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 thump. You remember that? Let's get back to that place. Is that subtle enough? Because sometimes I think it's how it is in our relationship with God. Like we forget what God has done in our lives. We forget what God has saved us from and what He saved us to. And where He's brought us. Things, get kind of stale, if you know what I mean, when, oh my goodness, if we really knew how much He loved us, and if we could really grasp what it costs, and how could we ever possibly not hear his voice? How could we not throw ourselves down at his feet and say, oh my God, here I am, all of me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Whatever you need, whatever you want, I'm yours, Lord. You have been so good to me. Bottom line, friends, this little church needed each other. If they were going to stay focused on the mission, if they were going to grow in their relationship with their Savior and not drift, if they were going to stay fixated on Jesus, they needed each other. And this little church, you and I, us and you, we need each other. I need you. The Lord needs you. We need each other to help remind one another where God has worked, what he has done, and how he is currently working, and where we need to be partnering with him. We need one another. So let's encourage one another. Let's share our stories of what God is doing over the phone when we talk to each other. When we gather here for services in our connection groups. I mean, we've got these little cards in the back right next to Ainsley. There's a little box there that says Stories of Life Transformation, right? Raise your hand, Ainsley. Put up. Everybody look at Ainsley, right? So, yeah, there's some pens and there's some little cards, and you can write down a story of what God is doing in your life and share that, and we can use that to encourage one another. Or if you're super techie and you have a problem being on your phone instead of with your wife, you can text 833-406-7996, the word story there, and share online. You can use it there, and then we can celebrate what God has done and is doing in your life. In fact, just the other night, I was in awe of how our students were doing this. They are engaging their friends in spiritual conversations. They were sharing their stories about how they were planting seeds and engaging their friends. I hope they don't mind me sharing, but I was so impressed the other night. I was so impressed because they were setting a tremendous, tremendous example. So as we close this morning, here's what I want us to think about. Number one, how are you personally being an encouragement to those around you? How are you being an encouragement to those that you gather with on Sunday morning? Go ahead, look around the room. Don't make eye contact, that's weird. But look around the room, okay? How are you being an encouragement to these folks that are gathered with you right now, right here, and you're trying to worship Jesus together? We're in this together, trying to make a difference in our community. How are we encouraging one another? Are we reaching out to those who feel disconnected? When somebody new walks in the door, are we like, I don't know them, right? And then we just kind of stay in our little huddle? Or do we like, hey, what's your name? I'm glad you're here. I'd like to get to know you. I'm going to ask you your name like 20 times, and it's going to be really annoying, but I'm going to get to know you. Because, guys, it's a big job. Nobody can do it by themselves. No one person can do this thing by themselves. It takes all of us. So who needs a phone call? Who don't you see in a seat? Who needs a phone call? Who needs an encouraging note? Who needs a visit? Who needs to be taken out for a coffee or a soda? How are each of us trying to encourage one another? Who needs a word? Who needs to be prayed with? Not just prayed for, but prayed with. That's number one. Number two, second, how are you personally growing in your own faith? How are you carving out that space to be near Jesus? Because our personal growth has an effect on the people around us. It's not just about you and your relationship with Jesus. Our relationship with Jesus, each of us, our personal relationship with Jesus, and how close we are in relationship with God affects everybody else that we come into contact with. The closer that we get to Jesus, the more of Jesus others get to experience in our lives. Here's the truth revealed here in this text, guys. We can fixate on a lot of things. But Jesus is better. We can fixate on a lot of things. But Jesus is better. So what are we going to fixate on?